Before you picture the crown, before you imagine the silk cathedral-length veil, before you summon the image of that 10.47-carat diamond engagement ring glinting in the Mediterranean sun, erase all of it. Start instead with a brick. One plain, unremarkable Philadelphia brick, laid by the calloused hands of an Irish immigrant son who had exactly $7,000 in his pocket and an ambition so enormous it could have crushed the whole city. That brick is where the story actually begins. Not in Monaco. Not on the red carpet. Not in the pages of Paris Match. In the dirt and dust and hunger of a family that refused with every fiber of its being, to stay small. Because this is not simply the story of Grace Kelly, the most glamorous princess of the 20th century. This is the story of the Kelly sisters, all of them. Women who were products of a man who built an empire with his bare hands and then handed his daughters a world where everything was possible and nothing was ever quite enough. This is the story of Peggy, the forgotten eldest who was her father's favorite even when the whole world was paying attention to Grace. It is the story of Lizanne, the baby of the family, who loved quietly and lost loudly and was the one holding the telephone when the worst call of her life came in. And it is, of course, the story of Grace herself, that so-called ice queen who was, in reality, a volcano beneath the snow, a woman whose private life would have shocked the Paris court of Louis XIV, let alone the pristine parlors of 1950s Philadelphia. This is the story of American ambition crashing into European royalty. It is the story of what happens when a family built on bricks decides it deserves a palace. And it is, above all else, the story of what the palace costs you once you're inside. John Brendan Kelly Sr. was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was born in 1889, one of 10 children in an Irish immigrant family that had fled the poverty of County Mayo and landed, as so many did, in the working-class neighborhoods of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The city was booming, dirty, ambitious, and full of men who were willing to bleed for a better life. Jack Kelly was exactly that kind of man. He started laying bricks. He was so physically powerful, so disciplined, so methodical that he turned a tradesman's skill into a construction empire. By the time his children were growing up, the bricklayer's son was a millionaire, a 3-time Olympic gold medalist in rowing, a distinction that included the diamond sculls at Britain's Henley Royal Regatta after the original organizing committee tried to ban him for being a tradesman, and one of the most politically connected Democrats in Philadelphia. He counted President Franklin D. Roosevelt among his personal associates. He built his family a grand colonial-style mansion in East Falls, Philadelphia, in 1929. The house had servants and a chauffeur. Jack Kelly had arrived. But here's the truth about men who build empires from nothing. They carry the hunger with them forever. No matter how high they climb, no matter how thick the carpets or how fine the china, there is always something they feel they must still prove, still earn, still win. Jack Kelly was never truly satisfied. He was a demanding, competitive patriarch who evaluated his children the way he evaluated a rowing race, with absolute precision and absolutely no sentimentality. He had 4 children: Margaret, known always as Peggy, born in 1925, John Jr., called Kel, born in 1927, Grace Patricia, born November 12, 1929, and Elizabeth, the baby of the family, known to everyone as Liz and born in 1933. Of these 4 children, the one Jack loved most completely, most openly, and most proudly was not the one who would become the most famous woman in the world. It was Peggy. Peggy was his firstborn daughter, his athletic girl, his physical match. Grace, thin, sickly, shy, half hidden behind glasses and headscarves, was, in the words of family observers, simply not the star of the show. Not yet. Grace Kelly grew up in a house full of accomplishment and short on warmth. Her father thought acting was, in his precise words, a slim cut above being a streetwalker. Her mother, Margaret, was cold, exacting, and deeply Catholic. The household demanded excellence in all things and tenderness in none. So Grace did what sensitive children do when they feel invisible in their own homes. She retreated into imagination. She played princess in the rooms of that grand East Falls house. She acted in front of mirrors. She dreamed herself into other lives, other stories, other worlds. And in a detail that every biographer has noted with the kind of irony that only real life can manufacture, the girl who grew up pretending to be a princess would eventually become one. But not, as it turned out, in the way stories are supposed to go. There was a restlessness in Grace Kelly that her demure exterior concealed brilliantly. She attended the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, having talked her way into acceptance despite a voice that was initially too nasal, too flat, too Philadelphia. She worked on it. She sculpted her elocution with the same precision her father used to lay bricks, one vowel at a time, one syllable at a time, until what came out of her mouth was that remarkable hybrid accent, slightly British, softly rounded, entirely her own. Her parents, believing that structure would keep her out of trouble, placed her in the Barbizon Hotel for Women, a female-only residence that was essentially a genteel prison for ambitious young women from good families. It did not work. Grace was, by multiple accounts, fond of dancing to Hawaiian music down the hallways and given to shocking her fellow residents by performing topless. She dated her theater instructor, Don Richardson, a Jewish man of whom her family vehemently disapproved. When she brought him home to Philadelphia, the visit ended in spectacular disaster. Grace was discovering, in real time, that her private self and the self her family required of her were in total and irreconcilable conflict. By 1951, Grace Kelly was 22 years old and had caught the attention of people who mattered in Hollywood. She secured her first significant film role in High Noon opposite Gary Cooper, a man 28 years her senior, legendary, married, and impossibly charming. The set of High Noon became the first chapter of what would become the most whispered about private life in Hollywood history. Gary Cooper, who was not known for his discretion, later described Grace Kelly with a phrase so blunt it was still being quoted decades later. He said she looked like a cold dish with a man until you got her pants down, then she'd explode. It was crude. It was unfair. It was exactly the sort of thing that was said about women who refused to be manageable. But it was also confirmation that whatever Grace Kelly was presenting to the public, cool, glacial, pristine, was something entirely different from who she actually was in private. Hollywood had always rewarded the performance. What it could not handle was the woman behind the curtain. After High Noon came Magambo in 1953, filming on location in Africa with Clark Gable, the man they called the King of Hollywood. Grace later joked, and it was one of the most effortlessly revealing things she ever said publicly. What else is there to do if you're alone in a tent in Africa with Clark Gable? Her mother Margaret, having gotten wind of the rumors, did what Kelly women apparently did when their daughters made uncomfortable choices. She flew to Africa to chaperone. It was a gesture as futile as it was determined. The rumors swirled anyway. What Grace apparently did not understand at the time was that Gable, experienced and unsentimental, simply would not carry the affair beyond the film. When they returned to Los Angeles, she waited.
He moved on.
Grace Kelly, one of the most desired women on the planet, had her heart broken like any ordinary girl in her 20s because she had made the mistake of feeling real things for a man who had not. And then came Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock, who was to Grace Kelly what the tide is to a shoreline. He shaped her, defined her, and understood her better than almost anyone. He described her as a volcano covered with snow, and the phrase is so apt that it should probably be carved onto her tombstone. He cast her first in Dial M for Murder in 1954, then in Rear Window with James Stewart, and finally in To Catch a Thief in 1955. Between these three films, Grace Kelly became the most iconic woman in American cinema. She was luminous. She was untouchable. She was, on screen, the very embodiment of ice and light. And off-screen, she was entangled in the affair that would nearly end everything. Ray Milland was her co-star in Dial M for Murder. He had been married to the same woman for more than 20 years. He and Grace began an affair during production, and unlike her previous entanglements, this one did not stay hidden. Milland's wife discovered it and threw him out of the house. Milland, apparently genuinely besotted, began talking about divorce. And then the math of a Hollywood divorce in 1954 caught up with him. The legal fees, the financial devastation, the scandal, and he retreated. Gossip columnist Hedda Hopper, who operated in those years as a one-woman tribunal for Hollywood morality, went after Grace Kelly with everything she had. She labeled the actress a nymphomaniac. She printed columns designed to destroy. And in any other case, she might have succeeded. But Grace Kelly possessed something that her enemies chronically underestimated: the ability to perform grace under pressure so flawlessly that the public could never quite believe the stories. She was simply too composed, too elegant, too pure-looking to be the woman those columns described. The scandal damaged her. It did not destroy her. On the set of Rear Window, working opposite Jimmy Stewart, Grace discovered that not all Hollywood marriages could be outmaneuvered. Stewart's wife Gloria had heard about her husband's infamous co-star and instituted what amounted to a domestic surveillance operation, driving him to work, staying for takes, driving him home. Stewart, always devoted to Gloria, remained one of the very few leading men in Grace's career who escaped her orbit without incident. But there was a reason for all of it. The studio system, the publicity machine, the gossip columnists, they had all conspired to create an image of Grace Kelly that was utterly at odds with her reality, and she had become so skilled at maintaining the illusion that even the people closest to her sometimes forgot which version was real. The country girl changed everything professionally. Grace had to fight for the role. Her studio didn't want to loan her to Paramount. Her response was typically devastating. She told the studio she'd send them her address, so they'd know where to forward their Christmas cards. She got the part. The film was unglamorous, raw, and completely contrary to the image she had been selling. She played a downtrodden woman married to a struggling alcoholic played by Bing Crosby, and she was extraordinary. The Academy Award for Best Actress in 1955 was hers, and on the night she won it, the story that has been told in whispers since is that when Bing Crosby went to knock on her hotel room door expecting to celebrate, he found Marlon Brando already inside. It is the kind of story that is impossible to confirm and impossible to dismiss. What it tells us, whatever its literal truth, is something essential about the world Grace Kelly inhabited: extraordinary talent, relentless desire, and a private life that would have destroyed almost anyone else. And so we arrive at Cannes, 1955. Grace Kelly attended the film festival and received an invitation to visit Monaco, the tiny principality on the French Riviera ruled by His Serene Highness, Prince Rainier III. The visit was arranged for magazine photographs. It was supposed to be public relations, a celebrity tour of a postage stamp kingdom that was struggling economically and desperately needed the kind of glamour that only American show business could provide. What happened instead was one of the most consequential blind dates in modern history. The story behind the story is this: Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate who had significant financial investments in Monaco's casino, had reportedly advised Rainier that the right bride could do for Monaco's tourism what Queen Elizabeth's coronation had done for British prestige. The prince needed a spectacle. He needed a face the world already loved. He needed, in essence, an American. And Grace Kelly, Catholic, from a wealthy family and Oscar winner, the most photographed woman in the world, was, by any calculation, perfect. But here is what the calculations miss. Grace Kelly was also 26 years old, had recently watched two serious relationships collapse under the weight of her family's disapproval, had just terminated an engagement to designer Oleg Cassini, whom her parents had rejected as unsuitable for his divorces and Russian heritage, and was, by most accounts, desperately lonely underneath the spectacle of her public life. When Rainier showed her around his palace and his private zoo in Cannes, something connected. They began corresponding secretly. When Christmas came, Grace invited Rainier to Philadelphia. He proposed after spending less than a full day in her company. She said yes. The Kelly family was ecstatic. Jack Kelly, the Olympic champion, the millionaire contractor, the man who had been turned away from the Henley Regatta for being a tradesman, now had a daughter who was going to be a princess. Rainier was Catholic. He was 6 years older than Grace. He had never been married. He was, by her father's standards, exactly right. What Jack Kelly apparently did not pause to consider, what none of them considered, was what becoming a princess in a tiny Mediterranean principality would actually cost his daughter. The engagement was announced in January 1956. The Kelly mansion in East Falls became the site of a media invasion so total that Jack Kelly himself orchestrated it like a military operation, directing TV crews to the basement and still photographers to the second floor with the proud authority of a man who had personally ensured the floors would hold the weight. Grace stood in her parents' house, in front of that fireplace, holding out her diamond ring, and she smiled the smile she had been practicing since she was a lonely child playing princess in these same rooms. And if she had private doubts, if she felt the first chill of what was coming, she did not show it. She was, after all, a trained actress. The wedding took place on April 19, 1956, in Monaco, and was watched by 30 million people on television, one of the first events of its kind in the modern era. Grace wore a dress constructed from 25 yards of silk taffeta, 100 yards of silk net, and antique rose point lace, with a veil covered in thousands of hand-sewn pearls. She looked exactly like what the world wanted her to be. She and Rainier disliked their wedding photographs so intensely, overwhelmed by the paparazzi and the crushing crowds, that they refused to look at them for an entire year. The honeymoon was a 7-week cruise. And then it was over. And Grace Kelly walked into the palace. She would never leave. What the fairy tale does not mention, what no fairy tale ever mentions, is the morning after. The morning after the carriage ride and the wedding bells and the cathedral veil, when the new princess woke up in a foreign country, surrounded by courtiers speaking a language she was still learning, in a marriage to a man she had known for a matter of months, with every film she had ever made banned from public screening in the principality because her husband had decided that it was unseemly for a princess to be seen on a cinema screen. Grace Kelly, who had clawed her way to the top of the most competitive industry in the world on the strength of her talent and her willpower, was not allowed to act. She was not allowed to work. She was a wife. She was a princess. She was expected to produce heirs and attend functions and represent the principality at galas. She was expected to perform the greatest role of her career, and to do it without a script, without a director, and without applause. The loneliness descended like a fog. Rainier's family gave her the cold shoulder. The palace staff had loyalties forged over decades. The Monegasques regarded her initially with the particular reserve that small, ancient communities have for outsiders who arrive with cameras and fanfare. Grace wrote to friends that the palace was beautiful, yes, but it was isolating. She wrote that she missed working. She missed New York. She missed the particular freedom of being nobody's princess, but her own. In public, she was perfect. In private, she was suffering. Within 9 months of the wedding, she gave birth to Princess Caroline. A year later, Prince Albert arrived, the male heir Rainier needed to secure the dynasty. Grace had passed the fertility test the palace had required of her before the engagement. She had delivered. She had 2 children she adored, and a marriage that grew increasingly distant, increasingly cold, increasingly defined by Rainier's jealousy of her fame and his emotional unavailability. He was a man who could be hot-tempered and withholding, who attended Grace's annual poetry readings, one of the few creative outlets she retained, only sporadically, and who seemed constitutionally incapable of understanding that his wife's unhappiness was real. By 1960, Grace had lost her father to heart disease. The grief was profound. Jack Kelly had been, for all his coldness and his favoritism and his impossible standards, the most powerful presence in her life. She suffered miscarriages. She gained weight, and the tabloids noted it cruelly. She tried, in 1962, to negotiate a return to the screen. Hitchcock wanted her for Marnie, and announced it to the world. The announcement was met with such outrage from the conservative elements of Monaco that the palace was forced to issue a humiliating retraction. Grace gave the official reason as scheduling conflicts and her children's needs. Hitchcock, privately, said he believed it was the palace itself that had shut her down. She never acted again. The rumors never stopped, of course. There were whispers about an ongoing affair with Cary Grant, her co-star from To Catch a Thief, who had reportedly continued to see her even after her marriage. Grant was devoted to her. He called her the most extraordinary actress ever, and declared her his favorite leading lady above all others, including Ingrid Bergman and Audrey Hepburn. Whether the devotion remained platonic or not is a question that history has declined to answer definitively. What is clear is that Grace Kelly never entirely severed her connection to the world she had left behind. She cultivated artists, poets, and intellectuals inside Monaco. She revitalized the Monte Carlo Ballet. She founded flower arranging schools. She launched a poetry festival. She tried, in every way available to her, to fill with culture and creativity the hole that acting had left. In 1981, at a royal engagement in London, Grace met a frightened 19-year-old named Diana Spencer, who was about to marry Prince Charles. The two women found themselves alone in a restroom, away from the spectacle. Diana confided in the veteran princess that she felt desperately alone, terrified of the life she was walking into. Grace reached over and, with the tired wisdom of a woman who had been exactly where Diana was standing and had seen what lay ahead, said, "Don't worry, dear. It'll only get worse." The two women who understood each other perfectly were the two women the world would mourn most devastatingly, and both of them on a road. But before we return to that road, we must return to Philadelphia. Because Grace Kelly is only one sister, and the family she came from was, by any objective measure, a dynasty of spectacular human wreckage operating underneath a veneer of success so polished it nearly blinded you. Peggy Kelly was the favorite. Never forget that. Through everything, through Grace's Oscar, through Grace's engagement ring, through Grace's wedding broadcast to 30 million people, through Grace's transformation into the most celebrated princess in Europe, Jack Kelly's favorite child was Peggy. The firstborn daughter. The athlete. The companion. The girl who got to sit at the table when Grace was still in the corner feeling invisible. Peggy had grown up knowing she was loved and had built her identity on that certainty. And then life came for her with both hands. Peggy married twice. Both marriages were turbulent. Her first husband had a serious drinking problem, so serious that he was involved in a near-fatal drunken car crash. Peggy navigated these difficulties with the performance of composure that all Kelly women seemed to have in their blood, but the composure was increasingly hollow. She had twin daughters, and one of them, Mary Lee, ran away from home at 15 years old and was found a month later working as a waitress in a coffee shop in Des Moines, Iowa, living with her 18-year-old boyfriend. When the teenage couple married a month after that, Peggy refused to attend the wedding. The woman who had been the patriarch's favorite, the woman whom the family had orbited, could not manage her own household. She could not hold her own daughter. Peggy Kelly, who had sat at the head of the family table while Grace was still being invisible, died of alcoholism in 1991. She was 66 years old. There was no royal procession. There were no 30 million viewers. There was only the quiet collapse of a woman who had been loved too visibly and prepared for real life too poorly. And then there is John B. Kelly Jr., Grace's brother, the male heir, the rower who won a bronze medal at the 1956 Olympics and finally achieved what his father had been denied at Henley. Kel was popular, charming, athletic, and politically gifted in the Kelly tradition. He wanted to be mayor of Philadelphia. He was the son Jack had publicly championed. He should have been the next chapter of the Kelly dynasty's ascent. Instead, Kel fell in love. Long before the cultural conversations that would change how America talked about gender identity, there was Rachel Harlow, born Richard Finocchio, a South Philadelphia beauty who had won a drag show contest in New York, been the subject of an award-winning documentary, undergone gender reassignment surgery, and become the glamorous hostess of a Philadelphia disco called Harlow's. Kel Kelly, the Olympic rower, the politician, the son of Jack Kelly, left his wife and his 5 daughters to be with her. The relationship became an open secret in Philadelphia's social and political world. And then it became something worse than a secret. In February 1975, with Kel positioning himself for a mayoral run against incumbent Frank Rizzo, a story appeared in one of Philadelphia's daily newspapers suggesting that his personal life would be a liability. The Rizzo campaign was reportedly preparing a poster that asked simply, "Will the First Lady be Harlow?" The Kelly family matriarch, Grace's mother Margaret, who had once flown to Africa to chaperone Grace on a movie set, made a decision that defined her character and her priorities in a single brutal action. She contacted two influential Democratic Party members and asked them to deny her own son the party endorsement for mayor. She did not want Grace, Princess of Monaco, to be embarrassed by her brother's relationship. Publicly, she claimed that politics disrupted family life. Privately, she destroyed her son to protect her daughter's image. Kell's political career ended. His relationship with Rachel Harlow disintegrated. Friends described him as devastated, as a man who had been treated like an erring little boy by his own mother, who had thought her love unconditional and found it was anything but. In March 1985, while jogging in Philadelphia, Kelly collapsed and died of a heart attack. He was 57 years old. The man who had finally won the Henley race his father had been denied, who had been the living embodiment of the Kelly dynasty's athletic legacy, died alone on a Philadelphia street with his political dreams in ruins and his family's approval withdrawn. The Kelly family, which had always been compared to the Kennedys, had earned another comparison: the absolute willingness to sacrifice their own to protect the brand. Liz and Kelly Levine, the youngest, was the one who held it all together without pretending that holding it together didn't hurt. She was the closest to Grace. They had acted together in local theater productions as children. She had visited Grace on movie sets. She had accompanied her famous sister through the years with a quiet love that never demanded anything. When Grace sailed to Monaco on the SS Constitution in April 1956, surrounded by 80 trunks of luggage and 56 reporters, Lizanne was there. When Grace needed a piece of home in a palace that felt like a beautiful prison, it was Liz and she called. When Princess Caroline, in the early morning hours of September 14, 1982, picked up the telephone and said, simply, "Mommy died," the person she called was Lizanne. It is September 13, 1982, and Grace Kelly is in a car on a winding mountain road above Monaco. She is 52 years old. She has been a princess for 26 years. She has given Monaco everything: 3 children, decades of philanthropy, cultural revitalization, global attention that transformed a tiny principality from a backwater casino town into one of the most glamorous addresses on earth. She had sat across from Princess Diana just the year before and offered the only wisdom she truly had: it gets worse. She has not acted since 1956. She has not, in any meaningful sense, been free since 1956. She is driving home. There are questions about that drive that have never been conclusively answered. Grace was, by multiple accounts, a reluctant driver who preferred to be chauffeured. So why was she driving? The car was a Rover 3500, and when rescuers arrived at the scene after it plunged more than 100 feet down a ravine, her daughter Princess Stephanie, who had been in the car with her, was pulled from the driver's side. Stephanie has always denied she was driving. She has always maintained she was the passenger. The Monaco authorities, who controlled the investigation with the particular fastidiousness of a principality that had no interest in public scandal, issued communiques that contradicted each other and raised questions they never answered. What the hospital revealed afterward was that Grace had suffered 2 brain hemorrhages. The first had occurred before the car left the road, a cerebrovascular accident behind the wheel that would have rendered her incapable of controlling the vehicle. The second occurred during the hospital stay, a result of the trauma. She slipped into a coma. Rainier, who had spent 26 years as a difficult and sometimes cold husband but who had also spent 26 years loving this woman in whatever way he was capable of loving, made the decision that no one should be required to make. He took her off life support. Grace Kelly died on September 14, 1982. She was 52 years old. James Stewart delivered her eulogy. He said, "I just love Grace Kelly. Not because she was a princess, not because she was an actress, not because she was my friend, but because she was just about the nicest lady I ever met." Cary Grant was there. Nancy Reagan was there. Princess Diana, who had understood Grace better in one bathroom conversation than most people did in a lifetime, was there. Prince Rainier, who never remarried, who never recovered, who when he died in 2005 was buried beside her in the royal vault. Rainier was there, a man finally undone by what he had perhaps never fully appreciated while he still had it. The house in East Falls, Pennsylvania, sat empty for years after the Kellys sold it in 1973. It passed through hands. It deteriorated. By 2013, when investigators from the Pennsylvania SPCA were finally called in after neighbors complained, they entered the childhood home of Princess Grace of Monaco to find it flea-infested and covered in filth, the interior a horror house stripped of all its former grandeur. They removed 14 live cats, 1 dog, and 1 dead cat. The previous owner was committed for psychiatric evaluation and later convicted of animal cruelty. The house that Jack Kelly had built, the house where Grace Kelly had played princess, the house where the engagement photographs had been taken in 1956 with flashbulbs blazing and the whole world watching, that house had become this. In 2017, Prince Albert purchased the property for $754,000. He announced plans to restore it and open it as the American offices of the Princess Grace Foundation. He called the house very special to our family. He said he was happy to have saved it from near-certain destruction. He did not mention the flea infestation. He did not mention the dead cat. He did not mention his Uncle Kel, dying on a Philadelphia street with his mother's rejection still fresh. He did not mention his Aunt Peggy, drinking herself out of the story in a way that left no royal plaque. He did not mention the complicated truth that the house represented, that this dynasty, like all dynasties, was built on foundations that were magnificent from the outside and deeply, privately cracked from within. What Grace Kelly left behind is more than a legacy of style, more than the Hermes bag that bears her name, more than the wedding dress that inspired Kate Middleton's, more than the Academy Awards and the Hitchcock films, and the image of a blonde American standing on a Monaco balcony with a view of the Mediterranean at her back. What she left behind is a question that every person who has ever traded one version of themselves for another will recognize immediately. Was it worth it? Did the crown justify the cage? Did the palace compensate for the performance, the endless, exhausting, lifelong performance of being exactly what everyone around you needed you to be? Grace Kelly told Diana it would only get worse. And then she drove into the mountain, and Rainier buried her in the vault and never married again. And the sisters, Peggy, who was loved first and lasted least, Lizanne, who loved most quietly and survived, Kel, who was destroyed by the mother who claimed to protect, they scattered and faded and became footnotes in the story of the woman who became a princess. But they are not footnotes. They are the whole story. They are the bones under the palace floor. The Kelly family came from nothing. A brick. A $7,000 loan. A father with Olympic shoulders and an Irish immigrant's hunger that never fully healed. In 2 generations, they built wealth and fame and a dynasty so American in its ambition and so human in its disasters that it defies simple summary. They gave the world its most beloved princess. They kept her darkest secrets. They buried their own in Philadelphia soil while Monaco laid flowers on her royal grave. Grace Kelly was many things: actress, lover, princess, mother, prisoner, poet, friend, and finally, legend. But she was also always just a girl from East Falls who wanted someone to love her the way she deserved to be loved, in a way that didn't come with conditions or currencies or the specific price of a crown. She never entirely found it. And that, perhaps, is the most human and heartbreaking thing about her. The Kellys came from Ireland with nothing but ambition. They ended up in a palace. And the women who carried that story on their shoulders, Grace and Peggy and Lizanne, and the complicated ghost of a family that was always both more and less than the legend, they are not just royal history. They are American history. They are the story of what it costs to want everything and get something else entirely. The crown was real. The fairy tale was not.